Good morning and welcome back to our second Anchored in the Word morning reflection for the week. And today we're going to talk about the birth of the church at Corinth. Yesterday was background information, a little bit about the city, and every single environment that a church is planted in has unique challenges, maybe unique opportunities, and Corinth was no different. But what's fascinating about this story is really what happened in chapter 16 and 17 leading up to the actual planting of the church. And so if you really want to understand the story, you actually have to go all the way back several chapters in Acts, read through that to get the sense of it. And so today I'd like to just kind of hit that and highlight so that you can appreciate that a little bit more. So first of all, let's read the text and then we will jump into the details. It says, in Acts chapter 18:1, after these things, Paul departed from Athens and came to Corinth. Found a certain Jew named Aquila, born in Pontus, lately come from Italy, with his wife Priscilla, because that Claudius had commanded all the Jews to depart from Rome. And he came unto them, and because he was of the same craft, he abode with them, and wrought. For by their occupation they were tent makers. And he reasoned in the synagogue every Sabbath, and persuaded the Jews and the Greeks. And when Silas and Timotheus were come from Macedonia, Paul was pressed in the Spirit, and testified to the Jews that Jesus was the Christ. Now, before we get into this text, we have to understand what led up to it. And what we see leading up to this is God disrupting the Apostle Paul's plans. We read about this in Acts chapter 16, where it says, when he had gone throughout Phrygia and the region of Galatia, they were forbidden of the Holy Ghost to preach the word in Asia. Now, that word Asia there is not talking about Asia as in China. It's talking about Asia Minor. And so Paul's desire was to go into that region, and one of the foremost cities in that region would have been Ephesus. And eventually he is going to go to Ephesus, but he won't go for almost 3 years. And so God tells him in a vision, do not go. Instead, there's another region I need you to go to first. It says after this, they would come to Mysia, and they essayed to go to Bithynia, but the Spirit suffered would not allow them again. And they passing by Mysia came to Troas, and a vision appeared to Paul in the night. And there stood a man of Macedonia, and prayed him, saying, come over into Macedonia and help us. And after he had seen the vision, immediately we endeavored to go unto Macedonia, assuredly gathering that the Lord had called us for to preach the gospel unto them. So you would think if you're the Apostle Paul, that when you leave the region of Asia where you're planning to go, and then you go into Macedonia because God has called you to do this unmistakably, that you would have seen success. But in fact, that's not what we read. And when we come later on, we see that the first place that Paul stops is Philippi. And when he stops in Philippi, he and Silas are beaten and imprisoned without a trial. They're thrown into jail. And so we read this in Acts 16, verses 12 through 40. This is one of the few places in Acts where the Apostle Paul was persecuted at the hands of a predominantly Gentile mob first. Now, there were times that the Gentiles came after him, but usually it was Paul going into the synagogue, preaching the gospel there, where they would see persecution. This was different. And so after a very short stay, a few individuals are converted. Actually, maybe we could say several. We know the Philippian jailer and his family are converted. They're baptized, and he leaves Luke there in Philippi with a young church. By the way, Luke is the one who's writing these details. Then we see the second stop that he goes to. This is about a 3 days journey to Thessalonica, 100 miles away. And there in Thessalonica, we read about this in Acts chapter 17, verses 1 through 10. Now, Paul is not there very long. In this city, he spends 3 weeks preaching the gospel in the synagogue. When the Jews in that synagogue hear the gospel, they are primarily rejecting it. And so he turns his focus away from those in the synagogue to those outside the synagogue, the Gentiles. Many Gentiles were converted there at Thessalonica. And within a very short time, there is the beginning of a small church. But what happens next is that there is a mob of Jews from the synagogue who attack Paul. They drive him out of the city. They create an uproar. And the city officials have to intervene so that Paul is not killed. And so what do? They tell him, you got to get out of the city. And so he moves a little bit further down to the city of the town of Berea. And in Berea, Paul experiences similar blessings and similar trials. When he goes to Berea, the people there, talks about in Acts chapter 17, they receive the word readily. They diligently study the scriptures to see if what Paul is saying in fact is true. But the same mob that drove him out of Thessalonica follows him to Berea, and there they stir up a riot again. And when they do that, they drive him out of the city. This new church in Berea recognizes the urgency of the situation, and they send him on his way. And where does Paul go next? Athens. Now, just to pause and think about this. God interrupts his plans. He goes to Philippi. He's there a short time. He goes to Thessalonica. There a short time. He goes to Berea. There a short time. What he doesn't know is that the timing of his circulation across that region, eventually going to Corinth, is going to be God's perfect timing. God was not directing him away from Ephesus at that time because he didn't want people at Ephesus to get the gospel. He said his timing was right, and he needed to follow God's timing. And so then he goes to Athens, and there in Athens, he waits for Timothy and Silas, who are helping the church in Berea. Now, the story in Athens is very similar to some of the other ones. Not that he creates an uproar and he's driven out of the city, but as he waits, he sees that this is an idolatrous city. It's a philosophical city. In Acts chapter 17, verses 16 through 34, it tells us the details of this story. We've heard the story of Paul preaching at Mars Hill, that famous sermon. And as he's doing that, very few people respond to the message. Some even mock him. The only that seem to respond positively are a few women. And so Paul does not spend a very long time there. The next thing he does is he moves on to Corinth. And there in Corinth, he begins to establish what's going to be a new church plant. Interestingly, there's no record of a church being started in Athens. Doesn't mean that there wasn't down the road. But it's not going to be a significant part of the story that Luke records for us in the book of Acts. In each of these places, we see blessings of conversions. We see struggle, trials driven out of the city. You say, why does this all matter? It matters because this is sometimes how God works. Sometimes God permits struggle and he permits people to do things that in fact are very harsh and difficult because it's ultimately going to accomplish working out his purposes through the lives of his servants. And so let me give you a couple of details to consider here. One would be this. Paul preached the gospel. And when he did, he saw many people converted. But he also experienced intense persecution. That is what happens when people preach Christ. The second thing is this. He never spent very much time in any one of those locations. It's because the persecution happened too fast. In each location where a church was established, he left members of his ministry team. And those members of the team helped ground those people, those young churches. And those churches are going to become an important part of the story of the gospel going from Jerusalem to Judea, Samaria, and to the uttermost parts of the world. Interestingly, too, each of the cities mentioned, save Athens, becomes a prominent part of the story, a prominent church in the first century. This is how God works. And so as we think about this, you may be discouraged and frustrated with some of the things that you see going on, maybe even in our community. And you say, is God still at work? And the truth is this, he is at work. Even when you don't see it or you can't recognize it, you don't understand how a thing's going to play out. When we're living through history, we often don't understand the role that period is going to play in that long story. And so my encouragement to you today is this, be faithful, trust God, rest in his ways. Don't become weary in well-doing. In due season, we will reap if we do not faint. Well, that's what I have for you this morning. I hope that tomorrow, Lord willing, you join us as we keep working our way through this. We look at some more details, and that God will use this story of the birth of the church at Corinth to be a challenge and encouragement to you. Have a blessed rest of your day. Lord willing, we'll meet again tomorrow. Bye now.